My family grew up listening to contemporary Christian music. So while others were listening to people like Michael Jackson, the Bangles, Whitney Houston, Bananarama, we would listen to people like Michael W. Smith, Stephen Curtis Chapman, Keith Green, the Imperials, and of course, Amy Grant. Amy Grant was a big name, and she's really helped Christian music become popular in the mainstream world. But back in the 80s, she was building her career. She put together this song kind of based on the story that we're looking at today. It was called Angels Watching Over Me. Does anyone know that song? We got a couple, yeah. It's a fun song, so you'll never probably get this from me again, but here we go. It goes like this. Take this man to prison, the man heard Herod say, and then 4 squads of soldiers came and carried him away. Chained up between 2 watchmen, Peter tried to sleep, but beyond the walls an endless prayer was lifting for his teeth. And a light shot cut through the darkness of a lonely prison cell. The chains that bound the man of God just opened up and fell. And running to his people before the break of day, there's only one thing on his mind, only one thing to say. Angels watching over me, every move I make. Angels watching over me. There you go. You'll never see that song. I mean, I actually probably could song without it because I've listened to it so many times. I actually YouTubed it the other day, and there's a really cheesy video with it. So if you want to get on there and find that fun video, it would be great. But as we look at the story, Amy Grant, her thought was that the story is about how God has given us guardian angels, that these angels come and they keep a close eye on his people, watching out for them and protecting them from harm. In fact, this was a common belief of the Jewish people at that time. It says, David Guzik writes that the Jews believed in the idea of guardian angels. And it seems that some among them may have believed that one's guardian angel bore some kind of resemblance to the human it was assigned to. So, in other words, when they said that they were trying to say that there was an angel at the door, they thought that maybe this was Peter's angel that had showed up and not Peter himself. Another way to look at this story would be to think about the power of prayer. And it's so evident in the story. It says that the church was earnestly praying to God for him. They were praying that God would deliver Peter. And God answers those prayers in the most unexpected and amazing ways. They were praying that Peter would be released. But they probably had this different expectation than what actually happened. They may have expected that the Herod would just be like, okay, you can go, or he would change his mind and not want to have Peter arrested, or maybe he would have this trial and he would win the case and nothing bad would happen to him. But when we see that Peter shows up at the meeting place and they don't believe it, we realize that even though they were praying for it, they weren't really believing that maybe God was actually going to answer their prayers. Guzik writes here that their prayers of the earth was earnest, but their faith was not overwhelming. They didn't really have the faith that God was going to really release them in this way. Of course, can you blame them? I mean, look at that story, how this angel comes and taps him on the shoulder, wakes him out, sneaks him out all the way through this prison. It's not like Shawshank Redemption, right, where a guy tunnels through the wall. Or I used to watch this show called Prison Break. And this guy, some of you sounds like you watch it, he got a tattoo of the prison jail on his body. He gets arrested so that he can break his brother out of prison. It's a ridiculous story, but it almost seems plausible compared to the story that we hear today. Like, of course, they're not going to believe that Peter's at the door. But as we look at these themes, there's some great things that we can wrestle with and see how God is at work. We find truths of God and how he does listen to us and how powerful prayer can be and how we are called to respond to God through prayer. But I want to take a look at a different angle, a different way of looking at the story. And what helps is that we start kind of understanding why this book was written and how and the purpose for it, who wrote this book and what they were doing. So this book, the Acts of the Apostles, or Acts, was written by a man named Luke. Luke was a doctor. He had accompanied Paul on his missionary journeys, especially if you read later in Acts, it moves from him telling it, starts talking about the experiences that he had on this journey as well. And he was a very meticulous, thoughtful, methodical person. And so he wrote this book, Acts, along with his gospel, the Gospel of Luke. There are two pieces together. They were written to a man named Theophilus. And many suggest that Theophilus was a person of a high-ranking Roman official somewhere. And Theophilus probably wasn't his real name. They were using a code name so that they could get this information to him without him getting persecuted. And so Luke was writing this book to Theophilus to try to help him understand and convince him about the truth that Jesus was truly the Christ. He was the Messiah. He was the Son of God. In fact, he writes this in the beginning of Luke. He says, I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning. I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So Luke had gone and he'd researched the story of Jesus and the story of Jesus' followers. He investigated the claims of who this man was in this new church that was forming. And he was telling Theophilus that he could trust what he was going to say, that he had thoroughly investigated it, and he put together this orderly account so he could go and trust what Luke had said. And so as he's persuading him to believe that this movement is a good thing. Of course, we talk a lot about fact checking, right? Getting out there and finding out what the person is saying to believe if it's truly accurate or if they're just making stuff up. Because you could write this, Luke could have written this and just made this whole thing up. But the author who wanted, and they didn't have Wikipedia. They couldn't get on the internet and Google search all this. So he had to really figure out how to get them to know. And so what he did is he kind of listed events that were going on that could be easily researched. And he talked about people that were there involved in the story that were still alive so that he could go, that Theophilus, if he really wanted to, he could go and find these people and talk to them and kind of prove that the story was correct. So Luke, throughout his gospel and throughout Acts, would list people's names and say people's names so that they could go and find those people and talk to them. And so one of the people we see in this story is Herod, King Herod. It says that Herod was arrested some of those who belonged to the church. So if we look at the scriptures, we know that Herod's kind of a name that's used throughout. And actually, there's several different Herods used throughout the Gospels and into Acts. Herod was kind of the puppet king of Israel. He was set up by the Romans to be the kind of the ruler of Israel, even though Rome was actually the ruler. But he kind of had some authority, but was kind of also kind of led by Rome. And so you might recognize some of these Herods. There was Herod the Great, who was alive when Jesus was a baby. He was the one that the wise men came and went and said, tell us where this new king is born, and who became so jealous that he went and had all these innocent babies killed in Bethlehem. And then we hear of Herod that was around when Jesus was alive and doing his ministry. He's the one that married his brother's wife. And that John the Baptist was so offended he was calling him out, and that Herod eventually had John the Baptist executed. It's also the same Herod that Jesus went into trial with. But now there's a new Herod. Luke is talking about this new Herod, Herod Agrippa. And Herod Agrippa had a desire to be liked. He wanted people of his kingdom to like him. He wanted them to stroke his ego, to feel good about himself. And so what he did was he found out that this was a group of people that most of the Jewish people were not happy with, especially the Jewish leaders. And he was going to persecute them so that he could win favor. He said that he arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. And so then he lists the first person that he decides to persecute, the main one. He says that they had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. And so Luke mentions this man, James. James was one of Jesus' disciples. He was the first of Jesus' disciples to be martyred, to be executed for believing in Jesus and preaching about him. He was when Jesus called Peter and the other fishers, he was one of those 4 fishers that Jesus said, become fishers of men. He was one of the 3 disciples that was with Jesus at the Transfiguration. And so he was a well-known disciple, one of Jesus' inner circle. And then it also says, Luke says he was James, John's brother. John was the longest living disciple. All the other disciples of Jesus were killed. John was not. He was sent to be exiled in the land of Patmos, an island where he lived in prison for a long time. And so Theophilus would have heard about John. John had built a name in the Christian church and was well loved by people. And so if he really wanted to, he could go find John on Patmos and try to understand the story. And then it says that Herod saw that this met his approval, so he proceeded to seize Peter. Of course, we all know Peter. Peter was kind of building up a scene there. He was the rock, right? The foundation of the church. He was the one that people were coming to, and Herod desperately wanted people's approval. So why not take out the leader? Take out take out Peter. Then Luke also lists a couple other people. He talks about a woman named Mary. He says they go to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark. We know that there's several different Marys throughout the Bible, so sometimes it's easy to get them confused. But one thing we learn about this Mary is that she is believed to be the owner of the upper room, the room where Jesus had his Last Supper, the room where the disciples were waiting when Jesus appeared, the room where the Holy Spirit came and descended upon them, which was a continued meeting place for the early church. They would meet at this home of Mary. And she had a son. Her son was named John Mark. And he was someone who traveled with Paul on his first missionary journey. And they had kind of a falling out. And then later he became friends with Peter. And it said that this John Mark was actually the author of the Gospel of Mark. And that Peter shared his stories of Jesus with Mark so that Mark could write them down and have this gospel account. And then there's one more person, another James. I know it gets kind of confusing with James as well. He says, tell Peter, when he's at the door, he says, tell James and the other brothers and sisters about this. This James was Jesus' brother, Jesus' half-brother, since he's the biological son of Mary and Joseph. And James and his other brothers and sisters didn't really believe that Jesus was the Messiah until after the resurrection. After the resurrection, Jesus appeared to James and was able to convince him that who he was. And James then became the head of the church in Jerusalem. And he would also write the book of James that's in the Bible. So all these people could be someone that Theophilus could look at and research and try to understand what was going on. But there's one more person in the story, one more person that seems almost out of place. Her name is Rhoda. Rhoda. Who in the world is this Rhoda? She's not mentioned anywhere else in Acts. I tried to look into it, try to find some more information about her, and there's really no other story about her. We see her, they talk about her in this story, and that's it. So why would Luke mention someone like her? Was she someone that became a leader in the early church? We have no idea. Was she someone who was a close friend of Theophilus so that he could talk with her about these stories? We don't know. So why would Luke give her this place of honor? When there's a whole room of believers that are there praying for Paul, and they don't get a mention at all. They're just listed as they. But in the story, there's probably some big wigs in the church that are right there in that room, but the only person mentioned is Rhoda, this young servant girl who answers the door. And it's interesting, in that culture, unfortunately, women were not respected. They weren't honored. They weren't even believed so much as we see from the story. But Luke, throughout his gospel and throughout Acts, he's always honoring women. He's telling us their names and telling us their stories and talking about their faith. You might say that Luke wrote one of the best feminist literature, showing how God loves men and women equally and how predominant they were in the church. But this Rhoda, this young woman in a male-dominated world, wasn't taken seriously. And yet Luke wants us to recognize her as a great woman of faith. So let's take a look at just what happens with Rhoda. It says that Peter knocked at the outer entrance, and the servant named Rhoda came and answered the door. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was overjoyed. She ran back without opening the door and exclaimed, "Peter is at the door." "You're out of your mind," they told her. When she kept insisting that it was so, they said, "It must be his angel." But Peter kept on knocking, and when they opened the door, they saw him, and they were astonished. So what do we know about this Rhoda? What can we learn about her? First is that she seems almost insignificant. It says that a servant named Rhoda came to answer the door. So she wasn't a major power player back then. She didn't seem to be anything special. She doesn't get taken seriously, and we don't know why. Maybe that was her personality. But she was just part of the household staff. She was there as a servant, doing her job. While the others were there to pray, she was there to work. Of course, that doesn't mean that she wasn't there as part of the church and wanting to be involved, because we can tell from this that she was clearly paying attention to what was going on. And how do we know that? It says that she recognized Peter's voice. So she knew Peter by his voice. Now, I'll say, might not be the most church appropriate, but the scene when he's knocking at the door kind of reminds me of Cheech and Chong, if anyone remembers that, where he comes to the door and it's like, "Hey man, this is Dave, open up." And the guy's like, "Dave's not here, man." He's like, "No, this is Dave, open up." "Dave's not here." I like that one, that's my Dave. But she comes, or he knocks on the door and he says something, and she recognizes his voice immediately, which means that she had to be around. She had to be around in the early church, listening to Peter, spending time with him, hearing his stories, hearing him talk. And she must have had a good respect for him, because she got excited when she heard his voice. And she wanted to go and share the good news. It says that she was overjoyed, and she ran back without opening it and exclaimed, "Peter is at the door." So she's so overjoyed, so excited. She's discovered this good news. Peter is free. She had to tell everyone. She had to tell them this great news. She doesn't do it perfectly. Of course, she could have let him in. Might have been easier to convince people, but she was still excited and passionate, was really excited about this opportunity to share the good news. Next, we see that she's insistent in the face of adversity. The people there say, "You're out of your mind." But this is that when she kept insisting, it was so. You gotta feel sorry for her. I mean, she knows the truth. She knows what's going on. She has exciting news that God has answered the people's prayers. Peter is free. But no one is listening to her. In fact, she's getting mocked. She's getting harassed because they've been praying for Peter's release, but they don't believe it actually happened. And so they're calling her crazy. They're saying, "You're out of your mind." You think that people that should be understanding and should be compassionate and loving, this early Christian church, they're making fun of this girl. But that doesn't stop her. It says she is insistent. She doesn't waver. She has good news, and she won't change her tune. So even in the midst of being made fun of, she holds on to what she knows is true and insists on it and keeps telling them that no, Peter is out there. He is at the door. And the last thing we discover about her is that she is humble. It says that Peter kept knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. You would think at that point, if I were Rhoda and they opened the door and saw Peter, I would be saying like, see, I told you so. Or you were wrong, suckers, I was right. Anything to show how great I was. And how dumb they were for not believing me. But she doesn't do that. At least that's not what we see. She leads the people to the truth and then kind of fades out into the background. And like that, the story moves on. And we never hear from Rhoda again. So if we look at her, what can we learn from her? What can we take from her example? How can we use her life and help us understand our own spiritual journey? So first we talk about how she was seen insignificant. Rhoda seemed insignificant. She wasn't a Peter. She wasn't a James. She wasn't even a John Mark. But she had a part to play. And it may have seemed insignificant, but it was significant at that time. I mean, imagine if she hadn't answered the door. Maybe Peter hadn't been discovered. He might have gotten caught and arrested again. But she was there. She was just doing her job, answering the door. It seems not that big of a deal. And the truth is that God, He uses common people, everyday people, people like you and me, to propel His story of grace and compassion in our world. I know I think I should be better than others, right? We should boast ourselves up, or we compare ourselves to others and we think, I'm better than that person, or maybe I'm not as good as that person. But our job really isn't about comparing ourselves to others. We can compare our churches to other churches and try to say we're one or the other. But the truth is, God uses all of us. He uses us as common people. The role of our stories is just to share our story, to go about and not compare ourselves to others, but to recognize that God is using us, using each one of us, to be people who are welcoming others, who are knocking on the door of faith. He's using us to point people to the good news that are questioning Him. He uses us He places us in people's lives. He invites us to speak His truth to people. None of us are insignificant in God's story. And we learn that Rhoda was paying attention. She recognized Peter's voice. She had spent time with God's people. She had listened to him, and she knew the truth. You know how they train people to study, to identify counterfeit bills is by studying the real ones, studying them deeply and knowing what the real bill looks like, so that when they see a counterfeit, they know obviously it's not real. And that's what we need to do. We spend time with God. We spend time in His Word, studying the Scriptures. We spend time together with other believers, growing in our faith. As we spend time actively serving God, and we spend time in prayer for God and His people, where we are a church that's striving to be building meaning through Christian community. This is how we grow. This is how we identify the truth. And that the more that we're involved, the more that we spend time with God and His people, the more it fuels our passion for Jesus, the more it fuels our passion for His church, and the more it fuels our passion for our world. Because we see Rhoda was full of joy. She was excited. She had discovered good news that filled her with great joy. Peter had been freed. He had been freed from prison. He had been rescued from certain death. And she was excited to share this good news. So excited, she leaves Peter at the door, out in the cold, but going to announce it to others. She may not have done the best job, right? But she did it with joy and passion. And as Christians, we have something we should be excited about, something that should fill us with joy. We have all been given good news, the good news of the gospel. The good news that we too have been freed from prison, freed from the prison of sin and death, released from the shackles that keep us contained. This good news that should fill us with joy and excitement, and this good news that should be shared with others. And like Rhoda, we might not do it perfectly. We might leave some people standing at the door. We may not say the right thing. We might not have a clear, polished presentation. We may leave some parts out. We may leave something standing at the door. But more than having the right thing to say is having that right, joyful attitude. God desires for us to have the joyful heart, to be full of passion. And that's so much better than just having a perfect presentation. When we share the good news with joy, even if we mess up, people will be excited by our joy. They'll be drawn to God, not by this well-crafted argument, but by being joyful and loving and compassionate people, because the joy of the Lord is our strength. And then we see that Rhoda was insistent amidst adversity. She remained determined even under pressure, even under mockery. She did not want this good news to go to waste. She went and told them that Peter was at the door, and they were like, "You're out of your mind." The very thing that they had been praying for, they didn't believe. Maybe their faith was wishy-washy. Maybe they never thought it was going to happen. But God had answered their prayers, and they were going to shoot the messenger. But she was persistent. She kept insisting, even in the face of mockery. I know when someone comes to us with oppositions, sometimes we just want to let it go. Even if we know the truth, we're like, fine, whatever, and walk away. But Hebrews says this: "Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful." We can cling to what we know is true. We know it's true that God has rescued us from death. Jesus told his disciples that they were going to face adversity. And the sad thing about the story is that the adversity that she faced came from those people who were following Jesus. Those people who said they loved God and they loved Jesus were making fun of this girl. But Rhoda, she stays sharing the truth amidst this adversity with dignity, compassion, and understanding. And so we can be like her. We don't need to beat people over the heads and tell them the truth. We don't need to force them. We don't need to be obnoxious, but we can be persistent, being loving and sharing that truth, holding unswervingly to the truth, while being filled with compassion. And like Rhoda, we can be humble. She had a message. She delivered that message. But the message was never about her. It really wasn't even about Peter. The message was about God, and how God had been at work. She is an excellent example of humility. In Colossians, it says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather," rather, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking for your own interest, but each of you the interest of others. Rhoda valued others above herself. She was not looking for her own interest. She was looking out for Peter and for the early church. She wasn't there trying to toot her own horn and make herself feel better. We live in a world that tries to tell us that we need to say how great we are. Get on our social media platforms and post, share, like, get followers, build an empire, show the world that we are valuable. But Rhoda took a different route. She was humble. She humbled herself to the gospel. She humbled herself to the message. She was not allowing selfish ambition or vain conceit to take over. She thought of others over herself. And we never know what ever happened to Rhoda. We don't know how her story goes on, but her selfless act and her humble spirit shows us what true followers of Jesus should look like. So over the past 7 weeks, we've been looking at Simon Peter. And he is a great example. He's an excellent example of what it means to follow Jesus, the highs and the lows, the successes and failures. But today, in the midst of his story, we discover the unsung heroes of faith. The people around us that are quietly fearless in the face of adversity. The people that are filled with joy, overwhelming joy that comes from knowing the good news. The people that are persistent and insistent in the face of adversity. The people who show us the humble path of discipleship. So I want to encourage you to be on the lookout for Rhoda. Look for people who are filled with joy. Pay attention to how God is at work in this, with people who are humbly persistent, who face adversity with grace and compassion. And then learn from them. Learn how they hold on to that joy that's contagious, how they stay persistent in the face of adversity, how they offer themselves humbly to others. And then be Rhoda. Ask God to help you to be content with your position, to be a person who's growing in faith, to be a person who's overflowing with joy, to ask God to help you in the face of adversity, to go through it with dignity and tenacity, and ask God to help you be a humble servant like she was. We never know what happened to Rhoda. But in a sense, we've all seen Rhodas in our lives. So I want to encourage you, be on the lookout for Rhoda. Learn from Rhoda and be